Hi, everyone. My name is Tiana Fitzsimmons. I am a therapist at Counseling Services of Southern Minnesota, and I'm here today to present to you on the topic, how should school staff respond when we see a potential trauma response in a child? So first, I'd like to start by just talking a little bit about the word trauma and how I define that. So how I define trauma is an event that overwhelms one's system and their ability to cope during the time that the trauma is happening. And so whenever we're talking about trauma, oftentimes we're talking about loss. So if we think about even kind of in modern times right now, we're going through a pandemic. Children are going through this COVID experience. Could this be considered as a trauma? Possibly. How about the civil unrest that's been going on over the past few months since the death of George Floyd? Could this be considered a possible trauma to the children that we're working with? Possibly. Could a trauma be something else? You know, anything ranging from a sexual abuse to a bullying incident? Possibly. So then you may be thinking, well, what is it that I need to remember? How do we distinguish, you know, what's traumatizing to a kid and what's not? So one important thing to remember about trauma is it's the child's experience of the event that makes it traumatizing, not necessarily the event itself. So if the child's experience of something bad or sad or scary, that's what makes it traumatizing as opposed to just the event in itself. So when we think about trauma, it's not just about what happens, but about what the child thinks that that event means. So again, it's that meaning making. So I'll say that again, it's not just about what happens to the child, but about what the child thinks that means about themselves, about the world, about adults, and also, is someone there to help the child unpack whatever that is after it happens? So as we move into our presentation, let's start out by our first question. So what trauma or stress responses should I be looking for in a child? So I'm going to bring you to this graphic. I'm thinking that some of you might have heard of the fight, flight, and freeze terminology. And when we're talking about fight, flight, and freeze, this is our body's natural stress response to danger or to threat. And so you can see down here in the green category, the social engagement category. So that's where learning happens. This is, you know, when we're calm, we're settled, we're grounded, we're in connection to other people, we're curious, compassionate, we're mindful in the present. So this is the optimal level for children to be able to learn. And so if we move up into the categories where we start getting aroused, so moving up into that yellow category, we have our fight and flight, which these are two stress responses that we might see out of our kids. This is where we might see, you know, that anger or irritation, frustration, rage. So that's in that fight category. So fighting, it could look verbal, like verbally lashing out at a teacher in the classroom. It could look like physical aggression, you know, a child is angry, punching the wall, flipping desks, starting physical fights with other people. That's what fight might look like. Flight is when children are trying to move away from the stimulus. They're trying to use avoidance as a tactic to keep themselves safe. So this is where we see more of that anxiety, that worry, fear, panic. Could look like panic attacks, or it could straight up just look like kids moving away from you. So kids storming out of the rooms, kids leaving the area, anything that they can do to try and avoid whatever is stressing them out. When we move into the red category, this is the highest hyperarousal category, which is the freeze. So this is where we see kids completely shut down. So they may not be responding. They could be dissociated, shocked, numb, depressed, just a complete state of hopelessness. And so I like to use this this chart as a visual on how can I look for stress responses in kids. And another important thing to remember is that if learning is happening down in the green zone, but we have kids who are up in the yellow and the red zone, well, learning isn't going to be very successful at those levels. And so how can we assist in helping that child come back to that area of calmness and connection and reducing that arousal state? On the left side, you'll see these are just a range of common symptoms that you might see in kids under a state of stress or trauma. Anything from change in sleep, change in appetite, a fatigue or a loss of an energy level, concentration difficulty, physical complaints, so if they're often complaining of headaches or stomach aches, increased worry and anxiety, loss of interest in activities that they normally enjoy, lack of motivation, isolation, just being unable to get back on track, within a week or two after an identified stressor has happened. When we see these things, often we'll see a decrease in academic functioning and also some maladaptive coping behaviors, which these could just be concerning coping behaviors overall. So maybe substance use might fall into that category, maybe physical aggression, any other kind of concerning behavior, suicidal ideation. So basically kind of any other concerning behaviors in the classroom that we're worried about the child being able to cope. So what is key to remember in our approach as school staff when we are dealing with trauma? And the simple way I like to share this is that trauma equals chaos and healing equals safety and security. So this quote on the large part of the screen kind of captures the essence of that. So when people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not join their chaos. And so if we think, when things are chaotic, we need to bring our calm to that, and how that translates with our students as well. If they're going to be in a chaotic state, we need to be providing that safety, that security, that structure, that calm for them. So one of the key protective factors in terms of dealing with trauma and helping kids face trauma and work through is having that consistent, trusted relationship with an adult. And not just any adult, but also an adult who believes them, who supports them, and who protects them. And so I know that sometimes we think about some of the students in our lives and how they may not have access to as many consistent, trusted adults in their life. And so just remember that you as school staff are key and imperative people in terms of being able to provide that for your students. So your relationship with a child buffers stress and helps to avoid that re-traumatizing that's happening. So some staff have asked, how do I know if I'm re-traumatizing a child? And my answer to that is, well, let's examine your interactions with the child. Do they continue to provoke that fight, flight, freeze response that we talked about in the slide previous? Each time that we're coming into contact or each time that we're having that interaction, are we sending and flooding these kids into these states of fight, flight, and freeze? If we are, we need to recognize, hey, what is it that this child may be perceiving to be threatening right now? And how can I not further flood the child with that threat? But at the same time, I also don't want to completely avoid everything either. So I need to slow the pace with whatever I'm doing, whatever that seems to be threatening with them. I need to slow it down so that their arousal level can come down. So moving into how do we respond? So first, I think a lot starts with our connection and our relationship. So this means that we're seeking out the child first, especially now that we're in a pandemic and a lot is being done virtually. we can't wait for the kids to come to us first. You know, if we start seeing a concern with a child, we need to be making every effort that we can to connect with that child, reaching out to them, reaching out to parents, and being consistent with that. And once we do seek out the child, being present with the child when they're in distress is also a way that we can help buffer that child's stress. We're going to talk about identifying needs from the child's perspective. So once we're able to hear from the child about, from their perspective, what's happening, then that will lead us in how we can advocate and problem solve and access the next steps with the child to create a plan of, okay, how are we going to move through this? Fostering an ongoing relationship with a child to help buffer stress. So this part is crucial. This is the ongoing part where we have that continued seeking out the child, working on the support plan to help support that child, and then coming back, reevaluating with the child. Is this plan working? You know, so we have that continued back and forth going on between yourself and the child. And then the second part is developing and implementing a follow-up support plan for the child. So we're going to talk about the tiers of support within the school building. And then at what point do we refer for school-linked mental health services and children's mental health case management? So starting with how to connect and foster relationship with students in distress. So as I mentioned before, the green zone in this chart that you see, that is the learning zone. So once we get up into the yellow zone and even up into the red zone, those zones are not optimal for learning, particularly if we're in the red zone. That means the child is shut down. And so when we're shut down, we are not able to take in information. And even if we're in the yellow zone, if we're in that fight or flight state, we might be able to take in minimal information, but it's really not going to stick. And so part of being able to connect and foster a relationship with students in distress is being with them when they're in their distress. So seeking that child out first, let them know that you see them. And when we do seek out the child, if there are concerning behaviors that are going on, we want to be able to communicate observations and not judgments or opinions. So for example, an observation would be, you know, hey, Johnny, I noticed I didn't get an assignment from you today. Versus, hey, Johnny, I noticed you didn't do your assignment today. Because it's possible that that's a judgment there, because it's possible that Johnny could have been doing his assignment, but either didn't turn it in, or he did work on it, but he got stuck. You know, and so we really want to be careful about how we put judgments and opinions into the message that we're trying to communicate to students, because that's a huge part of the relationship. Inviting the child to share their point of view and speak on the issue of concern. So when we do have a child that we're concerned, you know, that they're having a trauma stress response or showing some signs of behavior that are concerning, we want to be able to invite the child to share their point of view and speak on the issue of concern first. Oftentimes, I think we can jump in as adults and have our own agenda about things or about what we think is happening. But we have to remember that sometimes the child sees that as us placing judgment on them. And so if we can come to a place where we invite them to share what's going on for them, instead of jumping in and kind of taking over with our own agenda and what they're doing or what they're not doing, invite them to speak first before we say anything about any of the concerns. What are the key parts of building a relationship? Next one, look and reflect on the child's nonverbal communication cues and observations. So I'm guessing that there have been times when you've tried to engage a child and they're completely shut down, or they don't have much to say, or you get the casual, I don't know statement all the time. The truth of the matter is the child actually might not know. Or they might know, but they might not know how to put that into words. And so sometimes as an adult, we have to read between the lines. And reading between the lines is using their nonverbals. You know, are they slumped over? Are they looking down? You know, what feeling is that indicating? Sometimes you might have to start kind of guessing. You don't want to tell the child what they are, but you do want to invite them, oh, it looks like you're really down and having a really hard time with this and not so sure exactly how to maybe put it into words. And, just kind of sift around and see. So you might have to do some of the talking for the child, but don't tell them, ask them, and kind of problem solve in how you could put what their experience is into words. Next step is you're going to recognize and acknowledge, and not only recognize and acknowledge, but also validate their feelings and distress. So maybe the child kind of opens up to you, that it's really stressful at home because I'm not able to come into school and have, see my friends every day and get help with my homework like I normally am. For you to validate them, like, yeah, kiddo, this is really hard. Like, I can tell that this situation is really frustrating for you because you're having to make so many changes on the drop of a dime. And so when we can recognize the feelings and distress and verbalize that, validate that for our students, this is one of the things that helps them to bring their hyperarousal state down. They just want to be heard. They want to be validated. And then throughout this entire process, we need to be able to regulate our own emotions. So sometimes us as adults, when we don't know exactly what the child's experience is, we can, again, kind of come in with our own agenda, our own frustrations, our own anxiety. And we have to realize that when we as adults bring in our own anger, or our own anxiety, or our own fears, or you name it, that translates to the child. And so we have to be really mindful of, okay, how do I keep myself calm? How do I keep my own anxiety in check? How do I keep my own anger in check? Is it that I need to sit aside and take some deep breaths before I even go into this conversation? How do I act instead of react? So after you've done that initial relationship building, and you've been identifying with the child, connecting with the child's feelings and trying to hear them out. Next, we're going to identify their needs from their perspective. So here's where we kind of go into that problem solving mode, about what's going on. Asking the child, to describe, what has your experience been like? And get them to talk and identify a little bit about what's going on for them instead of us as adults kind of bringing our own agenda in about what we think might be happening. Once the child's able to kind of open up to you and explain, what is it that seems to be getting in the way of whatever it is that we're trying to improve, then we need to reassess our expectations. Are our expectations as adults reasonable or realistic considering the child's state and circumstance? And so here's where I like to talk about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which the premise of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs means that we have to start at the bottom of the triangle of the pyramid, and that the bottom needs need to be met before the top needs can be met. And so if you think about, physiological needs, having food, shelter, sleep, clothing, all of those basic needs, that those need to be met. Moving up to safety, love and belonging, and esteem. And if you think about it, with learning, that's really going to come up in those middle pillars. Like, we're not going to be able to learn very well if we're not, getting food and shelter and clothing and feeling safe. And so again, when we're talking about how do we respond to children, when they're experiencing trauma or they're in this trauma state, that safety and security is a huge piece, and a huge piece that we can bring in that relationship. So once we can get those bottom levels met, or somewhat met, it puts the children in a better position to be able to come to school and to learn. Next, we're going to generate ideas with the child of how we can problem solve next steps. So when we're talking about, there's an issue of concern that's happening with the child, we're finding out from that child, what is it that's getting in the way, of you being able to come to class every day? Or what is it that's getting in the way in terms of you being able to turn in your homework? Once we actually can hear, what are all the things that are standing in the student's way? Is it that they don't understand the assignment? Is it that they don't have the technology that's working appropriately? Then you can really help the child problem solve through those next steps. And again, through that relationship is what fosters that resiliency with children. And so just the fact that you as a teacher care enough to reach out to that child, to provide them that support, lets them know that you care about them. And again, that is really fulfilling some of those, safety, security needs that the child is going to need to be resilient to get through the tough and challenging times. And through all of this, you want to foster that sense of togetherness. So, even when things are unprecedented, we don't know what's going to happen. We're still communicating to the child. We may not know what exactly is going to happen in the next couple months, but whatever it is, we're going to go through it together. Okay, we're going to do it together. We're going to get through it together. Because when you foster that sense of togetherness, it helps the child to know that they're not alone and that you're looking out for them. You're going to protect them. So implementing a follow-up support plan for the child. So after you generate some ideas with the child about, what's going on, what might the needs be, what are some things that maybe I can do in terms of being an educator, being a school staff, what can we do in terms of school supports to help support this child, and maybe what are some of the identified needs. So I want to talk a little bit about using the multi-tiered systems of support. So what this means is that there's 3 tiers. And so the tier 1 is the primary prevention. So this involves the delivery of high quality core instruction that meets the needs of most students in the class. So in simple terms, this means what intervention strategies can I use to reduce the problem with the entire class? So, or I'm just going to give one example. So let's say that we're having behavior issues in the class. What would be an intervention strategy that we can use with the whole class to address the behaviors that are going on? Maybe we create classroom community standards where we dedicate one class where the entire class is going to talk about, okay, what does our class think that the rules of the classroom should be? Have the students generate the rules. Talk about, okay, as a class, what should we do if someone doesn't follow the rules? Have the students generate. And so that would be an example of an intervention strategy that you can use with the whole class then to address an entire issue. Moving on to the tier 2 of support, which is the secondary prevention, this involves the delivery of research-based interventions of moderate intensity to address the learning or behavioral challenges of most at-risk students. So this is a service that's provided in addition to the daily core instruction. So in simple terms, this means that some students receive more targeted intervention supports in small groups. So what this might look like in school settings, maybe this is under the special education services umbrella. Maybe a child has an IEP or they have social skills groups that they attend. So that's an example of a tier 2 service. A tier 3 or the tertiary prevention, this involves the delivery of individualized interventions of increased intensity for students who show minimal responses to the either the tier 1 or the tier 2 intervention. So it's kind of like our last resort. We're exhausting all of our other options, and when those don't work, we need more intensive and individualized support. So this is where school-linked mental health services, a referral for that might come in, or possibly children's mental health case management. So overall, the multi-tiered systems of support, this is a prevention framework that organizes building level resources to address each individual student's academic or behavioral needs within intervention tiers that vary in intensity. So we start with that level 1, which is the bottom level, all the way up to a level 3, where we're having more intensive individualized support. So as I mentioned, tier 3 is the tier that we go to when the student's needs or concerns still aren't improving or being addressed at those lower levels, at the level 1 or the level 2. And so tier 3 is where a referral for school-linked mental health services may be of further benefit to the child. So school-linked mental health services provides a trained mental health therapist that is assigned to provide individual and family psychotherapy sessions to the child and the family within the school building. So we're really increasing that access by providing that additional service, which students typically would get outside of their school. They're now able to have access to it directly within the school to increase access for students who may not have had access before. So how this referral actually happens, school staff, which typically that might be like a school social worker or a school counselor, maybe a principal or assistant principal. It kind of varies depending on the school district, but it usually is a designated person who does the school-linked mental health services referral, where that particular school staff sits down and discusses the opportunity with the parent, and then the parent then completes a one-page school-linked mental health services referral form. So you'll kind of have to do a little bit of fishing around to find out who that person is in your district, but that person will have access to the referral forms. And then after the parent completes that one-page referral form, unless if the student is 18. If the student is 18 or older, they can do their own referral, being that they're not a minor. Then the school staff will fax that completed referral sheet to counseling services through their fax number. And so that's how it works to make a school-linked mental health services referral. Children's mental health case management may be another referral at a tier 3. And what this service is there's an assigned case manager from the county who is responsible for helping the parents of the child to decide on and coordinate treatment. So this could be from therapy or other mental health services or programs for the child. So a case manager can also help find financial aid or help the family to find ways to pay for their services. So how can a children's mental health case management referral be made? So again, your appointed designated school staff, whoever that may be within your district, discusses the opportunity with parents and directs the parents to contact either the social or human services intake worker for their county of residence. So the parents do have to be the ones to make the referral. We can't make the referral as school staff. The parent has to request the service for their student. So parents have to ask to obtain by calling the intake worker at their county of residence, the intake worker in the human services department. And the parents will ask to obtain a children's mental health case manager. And again, this is a voluntary service. The parents can also start it and end it whenever they would like for their child. There's no obligation that they are required to do this at any time. The next step, one thing that's important to note about children's mental health case management is that a mental health therapist can also recommend or make a referral for children's mental health case management if there is a diagnostic assessment that is completed on the child. So one of the first things that children's mental health case managers typically will request in order to start services for a child is that they need a diagnosis of what mental health condition does the child have. And so there's kind of a cross way that can happen. So either the parent can call into the county, human services or social services intake worker and request that they start the process to be assigned a children's mental health case manager. Or if the child is already in therapy, the parent can also talk with their child's therapist, who then can also make a referral and send the diagnostic assessment in for the child to begin case management services. So that's just a brief overview of what you can do as school staff, I also wanted to share some references for you if there are additional things that you would like to look up. I'll also go back to my contact information. Should you have any other further questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you so much for joining me and have a wonderful day.